All right, welcome everyone to States of Change Learning Festival Day 14. We're saving the best for last, as they say, with this conversation about the future of innovation learning. Delighted to be here in great company with the likes of Beth from UNDP, Beth Noveck, GovLab, from the Canadian government, Beun was former Argentinian government, now professor in innovation, Kelly Duggan from Nesta, Caroline Politic from Politics for Tomorrow, and myself from States of Change. The purpose of this conversation was really kind of continuing some of the ongoing learning that's been happening with some of the members of this panel today around how we think about innovation learning. Particularly, we're interested in public innovation learning, government innovation learning, how we want to talk about it, and capacity building approaches. And we thought it'd be useful to have a bit of a stock take, both in terms of getting some really kind of cutting edge practice examples to inform this agenda, but also to think about what emerges from COVID-19 and whether that's formats or otherwise, whether it's creating new challenges or possibilities in that sense. So the format of the session will be that after I say a few things about kind of the initial framing and sharing a bit of the why from our side and what we've been up to at States of Change, we'll do quick fire presentations from all of the speakers, all of the whole panel, and then from there on, we will open up for discussion, both in a little bit in groups, but then also sort of in plenary. It's important to say that all of you on this call have a stake in this practice in one way or another. You've all kind of stated your reasons to be a part of this conversation. So we wanted to keep it intimate, to really kind of have a really good foundation to collectively explore the future of innovation learning. So without further ado, and with that actually in mind, do feel free to share questions and thoughts and insights in the chat all throughout. We'll try to capture it both in this session, but also beyond, to use it to as a bit of a common agenda for this field going forward. So with that, let's just see if this works. So I also already mentioned COVID-19 as a starting point for this conversation, and certainly from our side, it's been challenging something that we maybe already knew, which was the sustainability in doing face-to-face learning in different parts of the world, always being present and always being able to let's say set up either physical or otherwise classrooms or learning environments where you are present, and that certainly sort of forced us both to jump online, but there's a bigger question there about the usability and the feasibility and the reach that you could have with innovation learning approaches, and what it takes to enable and drive them. In terms of what we've been looking at from our side, we've very much focused on innovation craft as a key concept, and this actually emerged from this sort of it's the dichotomy between methods and craft, and in a way there was a response to all the demand that was focused on methods, and saying, well, that's great, we can teach methods, we can teach the technical bits, but actually it is a much bigger conversation when it comes to making innovation happen in government, and if we don't take that seriously, we're going to set ourselves up to fail every time, or we're going to mismanage expectations when it comes to actually fulfilling the purpose of this, which is equipping governments to actually deal with the problems they're facing and create better outcomes for people. So we've sort of explored variations of this model and are trying to set up curriculum based on innovation craft rather than innovation methods, which includes, big emphasis on culture. We called it principles and conditions, sort of the top level of this model. And we also talk a lot about and focus a lot about mindsets, which we will hear from later on as well among the speakers. But the general point there is, in terms of actually embedding a new practice, actually in not just doing things once, but actually embedding it in the way you work, we have to have a systematic focus on both how new methods are sort of resulting in new principles that you have to take up personally and organizationally, as well as the conditions that enable them to happen and create the space for them. And another thing in that regard, which was very evident in the example I'll quickly share, was the focus on functions. So actually, how does these new approaches, new methods, turn into new functions of government? And this goes to the point of whether, which we believe it is, whether this is a question also of driving institutional change. So actually changing how policy, the operating model, how policy functions work, how procurement functions work, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a much more messy picture. And this is what made it really hard to think about the pedagogy. One example from the Canadian context, working with a group of policy entrepreneurs from across the Canadian government, sort of made that very evident in the sense that it was a really exciting opportunity to work with a structurally different initiative that was organized in a sort of as a horizontal networked, almost like a network innovation lab, where different departments came together to share a systems transformation project portfolio. So in our work was to think about not just how they could deliver on that portfolio, but also what capabilities and skills was crucial. What did actually that professional development look like, as well as embedding that new role or that new function as a potential new way of working. Maybe we've talked a lot about the future role of public servants. But the question there, or the challenge, became working on those multiple levels. And I'm going to thank Bas for these models. This is his work, not mine. But thinking about then where you put the emphasis. And in this case, we put the emphasis very much on the project delivery side, delivering different in terms of business as usual, as well as on the organizational transformation. So actually thinking about how we institutionalize not just the roles, but the way that this group was organized, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a big question, and it becomes a question as well about accountability, about, what does the impact of this work look like when there are so many, let's say, bottom lines involved. And then finally, and this is another model by Bas that we used a lot in the innovation skills team, then it becomes a question of thinking about the learning modalities. And we talked a lot about, focusing on craft for us meant that the 80 or 90% of what we were teaching was in the informal learning space, or maybe in the mentoring coaching space, but certainly where it was not something you could teach in the classroom, but it was something that had to be learned on the job in practice. And it's much less sort of, or at least certainly a move away from kind of cognitive learning that was happening in sort of classrooms or training or simulation modes. And we're still certainly on that journey. We're still asking a lot of questions about how to make that move. And I'm sure we'll hear both from Bas and others today about what that might look like going forward. So I'll end it with that and jump into the questions, which also has been working as prompts for the upcoming speakers. So yeah, some of the questions we're asking at States of Change is overall, the theory of change for innovation learning. What is it actually that we're trying to do? What is the focus? Secondly, around how you organize, and particularly, are we talking about still skills development for individuals, or is it more about organizational transformation, and what's the implication of either? We've talked a lot about mindsets and culture versus technical expertise. how do we combine that? I think we all recognize the need for both, but how does that actually work in an innovation learning program? The learning spaces, we talked about in-practice learning, but that's often really hard to enable and to create space for, and seems to be one of the main challenges, actually, having the space and the time and the resource to really learn, reflect, and so on. So how does that work? What are some of our insights on how best to do that? And then online versus offline, obviously very acute in these times. But it's been a question all along: how much can you put online, and in what way, and what works, and what's the limit to doing that? And then finally, around scale and reach. So one of the big criticisms of our work has been that we focused on rather small groups, but in very intensive learning. The theory of change there has been around kind of sort of an ambassador model or a train-the-trainer model, working with a smaller group, but actually seeing that group sort of manifest or influence a much larger group. But certainly other ways of seeing that, and I'm happy to hear also from all on that in terms of how they worked in Argentina. So with that, I'll pass it over to the speakers now, who's going to each talk for 5 minutes around both successes, challenges, and questions they have coming out of their practice. So, and we're going to start off with Bas. I'm just going to check if he is on the call.
Yes, I'm on the call. Yes, sir.
Great. Bas, over to you.
Thank you. Let's see. Well, and now is the obvious question. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Something I say about 3 times a day. Jesper, thank you so much also for having me, and also very good to see so many familiar faces. As many of you might have known it, kind of a year ago, I left Nesta to join UNDP, the UN's development program, and actually to help set up the accelerator lab network. And I remember when I was interviewed for my job, why do you want this job? I said, well, because this is completely bonkers. To start 60 labs in just one go. I mean, the most obvious thing to do would start with maybe 3 or 5 and then scale it up to 10 and then maybe scale it up to 20 and another 30. But Achim Steiner, the administrator of UNDP, he set out a bold ambition to do this at scale, and this should be a shock to the system, as he often frames that. So we currently have 60 labs working in 78 countries, and we are currently actually also working on adding more 30 more labs to this network. And also in Achim's words, it's kind of, if we have 90 of these labs, then no one can deny the fact that they exist. So in that sense, it's a very bold ambition that he set out, but it was also necessary. Because what we see is that this world is changing at a much faster pace. It's increasing, and we also have a clock ticking. We have the agenda for 2030, so we have less than a decade to achieve that. And we're hopeful that we actually do tackle most of these big goals that are set out. So in that sense, there are also kind of related to the theory of change. There are kind of almost like 2 theories of change related to each other. One is to do this at a really large scale, so not set up 1 lab or set up 5 labs, but actually 60 or 90 of these labs. But the idea is also that that they don't operate in an isolated way, is that they operate as a network to learn faster about especially emerging challenges, things that we do not have on our radar immediately, but also look for the potential solutions and opportunity spaces. So one of the methods that we're using, for example, is solutions mapping, where we look for what are the solutions that are already out there. So some of the challenges that the labs are working on, waste management is a really prominent and big one, but it also relates to unemployment, the informal economy, it relates to healthcare, it relates to gender. So it's one big cluster of challenges that the labs work on, where COVID-19 most recently has become a very prominent one. So we used very briefly a couple of methods: collective intelligence design. We're partnering with Nesta on that. Solutions mapping, we're partnering with the Honeybee network. And the portfolio approach, I mean, it's a kind of broad description of how we actually design portfolio of experiments, but also how we make sense of the current projects that are going on in a country office or in a region. So it's a bit of a mix and blend of these methods, but I want to focus less on the technical skills in that sense. There is another hour or so that I can talk about the accelerator labs, but I won't do that. There is more information on our website, and also to point out, most recently we have published this report, The Fast and the Curious, that explains a little bit about our journey and our experiences in the first, let's say, 8 months of this project. So what are the successes that we have achieved so far? I mean, there are loads of small successes. To what extent we kind of have achieved our theory of change. I mean, that's still a thing that we're learning. We're also setting up our KPI framework to keep track of what we're actually learning and what we're achieving. But a few things that I'm proud of. This is a picture, by the way, from one of the boot camps we had, where we always ended the boot camp with pointing out the space for directed improvisation. So the mandate that the labs have to find their own way of working. There are, of course, things that they must do, is work on these pressing development challenges as one of the very few things they must do. And a few things they must not do related to ethics, code of conduct, fraud. We better stay away from that stuff. But there is a big space in between where for us it's, I mean, we didn't want to create a cookie cutter and tell the labs how to operate. So we gave some principles and broad guidelines that each lab could kind of also find their own way of working in their own context. I mean, we work in countries where there are conflicts. We work in countries which are a bit further up in the development ladder, and anything in between. So what we see is that the lab, the network is currently maturing. I see a lot of trust across the teams, but also how knowledge flows in between these labs. What's also interesting is that there is, given that space, I mean, it took a little bit of time before they actually realized that they have to do a lot of this stuff themselves. So there's loads of bottom-up initiatives currently going on, which is absolutely fascinating to see. And I think COVID-19, I mean, it was a bit of a surprise for everyone, but for the teams, they immediately jumped in. And in a way, it was a great opportunity for them to demonstrate the actual value of bringing in these skills, how they learn fast about an issue, an action-oriented approach. Also, what is the value of bringing in the unusual suspects, or find very different ways of gathering data to understand things that are going on or how things are developing. So COVID-19 in that sense was a really interesting situation, and it still is, where the labs are demonstrating their value, bringing in these skills and ways of working to the organization. A challenge, and that's I hope I'm not being too abstract, but it's kind of one of the things I see is that UNDP is a fairly large organization. With 17,000 people, the labs in total are, let's say, 180 people that we recruited. So you might say it's still a drop in the ocean. But what I see is that UNDP over the years has recruited for, I would say, one type of intelligence. And bringing in the labs, I see that there is a bit of what I call the battle of epistemologies, so how we create and validate knowledge. So questions that frequently that pop up is like, who's the expert? I mean, traditionally, it's the policy specialist who's considered the expert, but the labs come in and say, well, we've got grassroots innovators, lead users who have created their own solutions. So does this kind of problem analysis still work if we have the solutions already there for problems that we haven't identified yet? And that's also a bit of a distinction between the people most educated versus, let's say, the people most affected. And that's the idea of solutions mapping, to build on that the people who are most affected also come up with these solutions, which is in a way of kind of tapping into that as a source of knowledge. It's quite new. But in some regions, they immediately see the value, like in Asia and in Africa. The question is also whose knowledge counts, whether it's academic, scientific knowledge, but we also tap into traditional and indigenous knowledge. And where in a traditional system that is said, oh, that's a nice to have, but let's go for the scientific knowledge because that is validated in that sense. Or what is the data that we're using? And often kind of using official data. And it was in one of the sessions I had in Africa, where they said we use 10-year-old data to make a plan, which takes us 2 years to make that plan, to design a plan for the next 5 years. And so the world is moving really, really fast, and especially in Africa. So to what extent can we use the official data, the old official data, but much more tap into real-time data or ethnographic data? And this is where we often get the questions about, yeah, but ethnographic data, that's not reliable, or why should you trust all these stories? And lastly, that's a bit of the dichotomy between rigor and speed. One of the things, hence the name Accelerator Labs, is that we try to learn quickly, more quickly about these problems, as well as the opportunity spaces. And often a kind of an objection we get back is like, yeah, but it lacks rigor. So how can we actually tell that this solution might work? So these are some kind of arguments that are kind of ongoing. In some regions, we see that there is more appetite to kind of take up these new ways of working, whereas in others they kind of adhere more to the traditional ways of working. As Jesper, he also asked me to frame some development questions related to, for example, this last dichotomy, or actually paradox. There are a couple of things I see, and in my view, that relates very much also to the agency that we try to have in complexity and in uncertainty. So this is not, let's say, just about leadership. I see leadership not just happening at the top of the organization, but it happens across. But there is a question about being an agent of change in complexity. And there are 3 things that I see that not only the labs are struggling with, but also the people at the country offices, as well as senior leadership. So one is about plurality. That's pretty much what I already said. It kind of relates to the battle of epistemologies, where we currently have one dominant one, but and whether we need 2, I think we need maybe 5 or 10 of them, where we bring in multiple views, where we're inclusive in bringing in different sources, and so on. I think one of the hardest things is about something about paradoxes, where we're trying to manage the dynamics of doing 2 things at the same time. So this is not, the labs are set up to explore, but they're also set up to implement. And this is a bit of a tension that as well the lab as the senior leadership at the country that they need to manage. However, what we see, how people are traditionally trained, is to choose for either or, but this is doing both and that creates some complexities. The third one is something around patterns. What we see is that to take that step back and actually see these bigger patterns, but also do that as in a social process, as organizational sense making, especially for an organization that operates globally. This is one of the challenges, and we see, and where we have questions on how to do that. But to bring that back to maybe to one point, I would say that these things relate less to what I would say are the technical skills, how you do ethnography, how you map a system, how you build a prototype, but they have much more to do with metacognitive capabilities. And what we try to do with the accelerator labs is basically to accelerate organizational learning. So there is a bigger question about how we learn, how we become better in learning how to learn. And I believe that reflection is an absolutely crucial element in doing that. And I've come across that in my work for Nesta, and I see that at many country offices as well, is that there is hardly any space for reflection to do that in a structured way. There is hardly time. There are rituals, there are rhythms. And where I'm always wondering to what extent you can deal with complex adaptive challenges while you're not reflecting or not building that space. So I would like to end in that sense. When we talk about reflection or a reflective practice in that sense, what could that look like? But also how do we enable that? So that's where I would like to leave it for now.
Thanks, Beth. Hugely insightful and interesting. And obviously you weren't part of my very strict brief where I would tell everyone to stop after 5 minutes. But this was great in terms of actually setting the scene and really sort of thinking about the theory of changes. And you're mentioning spaces for reflection. I think that's a nice segue. We'll hand it over to Caroline, who's going to at least touch on that in her experience. So over to you, Caroline. Thank you, Beth. Maybe stop sharing.
Thank you, Jesper. Thank
Yeah.
you
Great. Thank
for inviting me. And I will try to share my screen here. I hope you can see it. Looks
Great.
like it. Thank you, and also thank you, Bas. I'm following your work where I can, and also in terms of the frameworks that you're providing, it's truly helpful. Jesper asked me to look a little bit on learning spaces. I think all of the topics are interrelated, and I'm just going to show a very brief insight or very brief glimpse in the work that we are doing at the moment. Maybe as some of you know, we did a short introduction on Exnovation last week. Why did we do that? We are currently busy with developing a learning program which is called Daring to Transform. And within this learning program, we're trying to build transformation capabilities within the Ministry of Environment and the Federal Agency of Environment here in Germany. And the learning program is actually constituted between civil servants of both organizations, including an extra new, I must say, one of the only learning organizations in Germany, the organization that deals with nuclear waste, that has participation as a kind of lawful baseline within their constitution. And this is what I wanted to show you in terms of the transformation context that we're looking at. So there are 3 different levels. Of course, there are many concepts like that, but we understood over our work that there is a kind of regime, there is a kind of mainstream, the kind of gray line that you see in the middle. And there are certain constellations that are changing over time, and now also what Bas said in terms of very short increments of time that are pushed into from the niche, so from the bottom line, but also influenced by a so-called macro level in terms of autonomous trends and paradigms. We have been always focusing on innovation. This is a model also that is more based on socio-technological innovation aspects, but we understood working with the Ministry of Environment that these kind of eco-cycle and ecological approaches in terms of natural renewal are important as well. And that so-called ex-novation is actually important to phase things out once new things have entered the system. A challenge for us in this program was that the learning space that we developed actually was 75% based in a synchronous on-site environment. And we developed this framework because before we didn't even think about it. It was just natural for us. So my question to you is, what was a significant learning experience during the last week? And where did it actually take place? You don't have to write it down, but maybe think about it. I think I had a lot of learning experience not in a physical on-site synchronous space. So what we had to do over the past weeks, we had to move this kind of natural understanding into more a distributed, asynchronous, and online on-site activity-based format. Of course, all of you know examples of digital collaboration in terms of mural ways of collaborating online, but I want to introduce an example that is actually happening in my street. It's a pandemic resilient city development initiative that comes within the collaboration of civil society and the city to actually see how we can build spaces and new public spaces for citizen engagement, for meeting each other, and also for sharing a kind of just space where maybe people from different backgrounds have never met. I've met new neighbors in my environment that I haven't seen before or that I didn't recognize as neighbors in the streets. And especially for kids, it's a so-called play street on Sundays where we close the streets and the parents are guarding that part of the streets where new engagement can take place. Our approach right now is to learn with all senses. And even given the challenges that the digital aspects are posing, and also, let's say, maybe a low touch economy or distance learning is posing, I think it's absolutely crucial for our learning programs to support different levels of the human body. How we're doing that, I think we all have to be super creative to find ways of moving in and out digital and physical spaces, learning together, but also learning inside us in a space. So this is something that we are working on right now. It's the model that I've been showing before in terms of learning space. We're looking at synchronous, asynchronous relations, online and on-site relations, but much more important is where's the inner space for learning, where is actually the change taking place inside me, where's the safe program space that we're building with our learning programs, online, on-site, how are we transferring that into the organization, but also, most importantly, how are we including public space? And in all spaces, we think that the digital and the physical infrastructures are very important, which also means that we have to be responsible in terms of what we're using, how we're actually driving and also introducing other people in terms of data management, in terms of evidence, in terms of responsibilities to infrastructures that will define our future. So this is a short input from me, and I hope I stayed in the time.
Excellent, Caroline, and really interesting, and what an impressive approach. I think particularly, thinking about the whole, the different aspects that you're mentioning, both the whole person as well as how you create safe program space, and also how you think about combining the online and the offline, hugely relevant. I think that is basically the segue. I'll now hand it over to Beth. My prompt to her was to think about the online offline as a starting point, at least for sharing their work at GovLab. So over to you, Beth.
Thank you very much, and thank you again for having me. And I think it's just a pleasure to participate and listen in on this conversation. We are coming off of, I'm based in New York, of course, and as people have heard from the news, this is a very politically challenging time for us. People are very keenly aware of not only how our governments at every level have failed to deliver on proper response to coronavirus, but now the kind of highlight is on the fact that we have failed to deliver on the promise of equity and equality in our country very much since the nation's founding. So there's really a sense, especially as we enter into an election year, that we have to do something to turn around really the disastrous efforts that have been made, not just in the Trump administration, but really over the last generation since Reagan, to really eviscerate our public service. We have had many talented public servants leave the government, especially in recent years because dissent is not tolerated, but also because there's been a failure to invest in talent in government. Even as there's so much discussion in the private sector about the future of work and the need to retrain people and to invest in lifelong learning and to have people think about their skills, that has not been a conversation that we have had about the public sector, where for too long the conversation has been, and this is of course the famous quote of Reagan, that government is the problem rather than the solution. So we're seeing, of course, because of coronavirus, where many states and cities have been successful at tamping down the spread of the virus, people have come to kind of have a renewed, I think, interest in the important role of government as being a way of solving problems and being part of the solution rather than being part of the problem. You contrast that, of course, with what's going on, and you hear, of course, the headlines in the news about, Eric Trump's wedding planner being hired to run public housing in the United States, or the fact that in our U.S. Department of Agriculture, they relocated their research branch, the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, from Washington, D.C. to Kansas City, really in an effort to kind of shut down and gut the whole agency. And in fact, by moving it to the center of America, 2/3 of the staff quit, and they effectively shuttered the whole unit without getting their hands dirty by doing so. So all this to say that I want to set this in the context, this discussion about skills and about talent, against the political backdrop about what's happening and about the real kind of interest in needing to do better and needing to do differently in terms of creating government institutions that are more effective, but also especially against the backdrop of these protests and the real light that's been shed on issues of racial equity, the need to create government that's much more legitimate. And that means we have to do more, and there's a lot of attention now to looking at issues of not only recruitment and retention and employment in government, but also the policies that we need to actually spread and engage in better training. Not just training, I think that we have come to understand through the successes that many people on this call have had over the last few years with training pockets of innovators, training, the new chief innovation officers, the chief data officers, the CTOs and whatnot. But really trying to create a problem-solving culture across all levels of government so that all civil servants, as well as politicians, have new skills driven by technology and data, but also the understanding that we've come to have about the need to design with people rather than for people to develop more effective solutions. So just to stay within my time, I'll just add that I think part of the lessons here is that we have to set this in the context of policy and be thinking about what we can do to expand and scale the programs that people are talking about here and to drive them as whole of government solutions across levels of government. It means we have to get away, in my perspective, from the emphasis, and this is a point that Boz made already, of discrete tools or discrete methods, the kind of one-offs or excitement that people have found in whether it's data analytical methods or human-centered design or behavioral insights or any one of the innovations that we've essentially come to see as so important over the last few years, is that we need to get away from doing those things as one-offs and to really begin to think about how do we connect things into a learning pathway to help people become more effective problem solvers, taking projects from idea to implementation, to think about how we can make people more effective at delivery and at really getting things done. And again, I think a lesson that's been pointed up in the pandemic where we've just needed to have more people who've been able to get things done. That means the combination of quantitative and qualitative approaches, and that means the ability then, as I mentioned before, to do things with people rather than for them. So I'll just close by saying, in terms of things we've been doing in this space, one is following on the model of the OECD to really launch a series of global surveys that have now been running. There's one going on now in New Zealand Australia, the US, Paraguay recently will be publishing those reports, and Singapore, to really look at what people's baseline level of skills and knowledge is and their interest in learning and developing these skills around an innovation pathway, what people know, what people want to know, and how they want to know it. And of course, what we're seeing is a huge disconnect between what people want to know and what they actually do know how to do. And that means we're also building on the learning from those surveys and years, probably a decade now, of doing coaching work with public entrepreneurs to build new delivery systems for teaching and training, trying to distill these learnings into new learning platforms. The Innovation Skills Accelerator that I'll put the link in the chat for, that we've created in the state of New Jersey, a new national curriculum that we're developing with ANZOG in Australia, and now come September, a new public problem solving MOOC that we'll be doing at NYU across the whole campus and making publicly and openly available. Again, with the thought being that if we want to create the next generation of leaders and problem solvers, it's not enough to wait until people are in government. We have to actually be thinking about training people while they're still in school to create problem solvers and to create also an interest in becoming public entrepreneurs and problem solvers. Let me stop there. I've gone over my time. Thanks.
Thank you, Beth. That was fascinating, and I think a couple of the prompts will be picked up by both Ol and Neil around scale, and I'm very curious about this question of going from one-ups to pathways. Might be something that Neil can maybe enlighten us a bit more from the Canadian School of Government and how they're approaching that. But before that, I want to hand it over to Kelly from Nesta. He's going to talk a little bit more about the cultural side. So a couple of people already mentioned the importance of that. So Kelly, do you want to sort of weigh us in on your work and some how you're approaching this work on mindsets?
Yeah, cheers, Jasper. I'll just share my slides. Yeah. So. Yeah, thanks for having me, first of all. I'm just going to talk a bit about a project we call the Mindset Challenge that we've recently run with Essex County Council, so a council in the UK that is currently over 6,000 people. They almost came to us while we were within another project in that context, asking almost to how do we transform the culture of their workforce. They've got many initiatives going on. People are complaining of initiative-itis. People are complaining about seeing the same tools and same methods again and again. And almost how can we do this, I suppose, whole person learning, and what would that look like? So a lot of, just to caveat this, a lot of what I've got here built on the states of change work, having worked with Brenton, Bass and Jasper previously. And this was an experiment, which I'm going to talk about now, which was to understand how things could be done differently. So it kind of covers two pilots that we did, one 9 days and one 3 days. So the aim of this project, the Mindset Challenge, was to almost jolt the status quo and to challenge learners to look more closely at the way they currently approach, cogitate and behave in their roles. So more critical reflection in this reflective practice, I suppose, and to create the space for learners to question the existing ways of doing things and establish new ways and start to practice them for the benefit of themselves and for citizens. So I suppose the theory of change, often people come in with tools and skills, people learn how to use them, they benefit from them or they see the value ideally, and then from there the behaviours ideally change, from there the habits change, ultimately the mindset change and the culture change, bearing in mind that you have enough people to carry on this idea and start to embed it. And what we were trying to do here was to go in at that mindset level, at that culture level, and start to look at and break down what the mindset is and how the mindset could essentially help to open someone's ideas and open someone's mind around innovation and the behaviours that looks like, the skills that they could use and the tools that they could go and find for themselves. So what do we mean by mindsets? I think it's just the person's way of thinking, their opinions, how they perceive situations. So we split it into three. And again, this is working with Bass. So ultimately it's your beliefs, your experiences, your education, everything that's happened to you to this point informs your viewpoint of the world and how you conceive situations and problems. And it was to take a closer look at that perception system, how you see, how you hear, how you understand, that thinking approach. So what your mental models, how they're shaped, how you interpret things and how you sense make, and ultimately how you act because of these. So we also use the competency framework as almost a base when developing these different mindsets. So first of all, we had the collaborative mindset, which was about understanding multiple perspectives, about demonstrating empathy and humility, engaging with other people, and helping to facilitate challenges with people rather than for people. There was the experimental mindset, which looked much more at the learning focus and how do you test your assumptions, how do you try new things in new ways, and how do you ensure that you capture the lessons of what works when, how, and for who. And then finally was the action mindset, and this is more the optimistic belief that things can be better and that you have a role in it and that there are opportunities for which you can do things differently and seize upon those opportunities. So they were the three kind of mindsets that we went through. They were broken down into different what we call elements. So we wanted to move away from the skills and almost have what you could consider attitudes, maybe traits, maybe ways of working. These aren't quite clearly established. This is just the list we got to so far. So for instance, the collaborative one is around empathy. It's all about putting yourself in the shoes of others, inclusiveness in terms of who we're speaking to, humility, being aware of your own expertise, but also being aware of other people's expertise. And also these aspects of power and trust, so recognizing your own power in decision-making processes and how you start to develop trust. Experimental, so you have your ideation, testing, learning, but also talking about people's curiosity and talking about how people deal with failure and really bringing those like tricky subjects to the table and how they work in the public sector. And then the action mindset was about self-efficacy. So a lot of what we hear is, these are very good ideas, I can't do it because. So tackling that a little bit more, looking at people's drive about why they want to do these things differently. Is there a motivation to do them? Looking at people's influence and how they persuade others, which are character kind of traits that help you persuade someone versus which are organizational positions that help you do that, and the ways in which you communicate with others. So very briefly, what we did was split, this is a 3-day session. We split it into mindsets. So day one was about the collaborative and using a project, so a small challenge to work on as a vehicle of learning. We'd have like a conceptualization, so an activity, which in a sense jolted people's thinking and made them question immediately across all those elements of that specific mindset. And then we rehearsed different ways you could apply these to a practice. So we applied it to a challenge, and also they reflected on what that meant for their own personal challenge that they brought with them. And then in the afternoon, it was almost a whole protected space of reflection where they not only reflected on their individual abilities. So say it was around the empathy. It was, how do I perform empathy in my role? How don't I? And why do I? So it was trying to do this triple loop learning almost of, what do we do? What happened for us to do that? Is that the right thing to do? And why did we think that was the right thing to do in the first place? And almost prompting this conversation around those very deep kind of nuanced areas. And then we also took the organizational level where, again, we reflected on what does the organization do to support the mechanisms to help this collaborative mindset? How does it support empathy? How does it support you being humble? And try to break down those different core elements and look at the mechanisms and structures that the organization has. It was informed by this. I won't go into this now, but it was essentially trying to have as many circles around this, as many disorienting dilemmas as possible, to have those constant, I'm not going to start thinking of new ways of doing things unless I already doubt the ways that I do them now. So successes in terms of what we did on this particular project, I think people did go away with a general feeling of, yeah, I do think about things different now, but this is not rigorous. This is kind of a very quick survey afterwards, but they did think differently. It helps to have the time to make the mindset settle and start to think about how you can use this in different scenarios rather than throwing techniques at people and expecting them just to take away and do them in multiple different scenarios. The biggest one we probably had was, you're not trying to give us a method or a methodology that we have to kind of maneuver and apply to the problem. We're going to meet lots of different problems, and now you've given us a different way to think about those problems. Challenges and assumptions. This is just to kind of lead into the challenge. I think one of the activities that we do that I really enjoyed was this Poleaxe game, which is usually done around futures. So you ask people about their perception of the world, the organization, their team, and whether it's improving or getting worse, and also their influence level in it. Can you influence it and can't you? And this really opened up conversations around the organization itself. So we often found that in the top right-hand corner, that was the new people. So new people who joined an organization were like, yeah, we can definitely do things better. Things are quite good as they are. And then the longer that people had been there, they were more towards this bottom left-hand corner. And they were like, no, it's rubbish, can't change anything. I'm sick of hearing the same things again. Leadership never changes. And I suppose in terms of a challenge, I think there's questions I have around what we're teaching people when and who. I know sometimes we aim towards like the coalition of the willing and try and select people and recruit people to have this small team who will then promote it and change a culture throughout the organization. But I suppose my thinking now is people need to be told different things at different times. So is there a, you know, the skepticals and the people that are voluntold that we're dragging with us, did they just need to know more about why and what does that look like in terms of online, offline, or however we place that? Is that more challenging and more deep conversations? When it's the advocates and the self-selected, they're already on board, you're preaching to the choir. So is that more about the how? And then it can be methods within different situations. And then the like unexposed, they just need to know what it is and maybe a bit of the why. But that's just kind of challenges and thinking to what we do. Another challenge is this was all done face to face. We're very active, we're very practical. A lot of what we do is making and building. And what does that look like now that we have to do it all remotely? So we're running this again, but this has all changed. And it now is going to be a fully remote course. So what does that mean in terms of blended learning? I think we're all learning how to do online learning a lot better, but I think Caroline, your ideas already, I started to think about how this could be applied for this. That was really useful. In terms of questions, I suppose these are quite personal. I've been in the innovation field for about 4 years, so I'm relatively new, so maybe naive and maybe repeating things that other people have gone through. But I suppose my questions now around innovation skills, have they changed now that we're moving into this post-COVID world? Our mindset's the same, but now it's for recovery and reimagining. Is it just turning the volume up? Are they actually more applicable? Around when we use our mindsets around being collaborative, what does that look like when you're taking that onto the online world? And ethics aren't going to bring everyone back to the office. Some people are going to work remotely now. And what does that mean for citizen engagement and all the other skills that we've talked about? Scope, I think tensions between delivery on capacity building skills and personal integrity. Maybe this is a personal one, which using this model that Jesper introduced earlier, sometimes I go in knowing that it's not enough, that we can go in and we can talk about mindsets and I can talk about methods, but we keep having to have that constant tension saying, this isn't enough and it's not going to change if we come in and do this. And you don't want to waste people's money, but you have to try and push them to start thinking about these conditions and functions. And then the last one would be around the tailoring. How can we better understand the challenges within the organizations in terms of need and readiness, in terms of what they're working on, just in terms of being there and understanding the culture properly. But yeah, I won't go over my time, and that's that from me.
Thank you, Kelly. That was a great walkthrough and good to see kind of a practical experiment in the works. And great questions as well. Let's see if we can pick some of those up, and I'll encourage participants to put their thoughts into the chat as well at this time. We are running a little late, and not to at any fault of the content. This is really a tour de force, which I was expecting. So thank you so far. We have 2 more inputs, and then we'll do a little bit of group reflection afterwards. Do you want to pick up the baton and talk a little bit about your work in Argentina and particularly how you dealt with scale?
Yep. Just let me share my presentation. So can everyone see this? Yep. So hi everyone, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we scaled innovation capabilities to foster government's transformation, or as we like to call it, moving the elephant, right? So this is a challenge we all have. This is the main challenge. How do we develop a culture of innovation in one of the most complex and biggest organizations in the country? And by biggest, I mean 250,000 public servants in the case of the federal government of Argentina. So when I'm facing really complex challenges as this one, I like to break it down a little bit and try to have a more clear vision of what we are facing. So we're a small team with few resources trying to build innovation capabilities throughout the public administration, or in a way trying to move this elephant, right? And moving an elephant by yourself is really, really hard. So what's the solution? Oh, okay, let's just call some other people, give them innovation tools so we can all together move the elephant. And I like to see culture as the sum of people plus processes, right? So if you give new processes, if you teach new methods, new tools to these people, you can, by the end, create a more innovative culture. But maybe this is oversimplifying the solution, because not only because training massively public servants in terms of innovation requires a lot of operational effort, but because ultimately what you're doing is competing for public servants' attention between your training programs and all the other things in life, all the priorities and interests they have. So what did we do in Argentina? We started small, of course. We did some prototypes of training programs that had three main characteristics. The first one was the democratization of innovation, was demystifying that innovation was only entitled for the private sector or it involved technological solutions. The second characteristic is that we used a learning by doing methodology because it was really attractive for public servants. And the third one is that we used a user-centered approach to develop and implement all these training programs. Basically because, as I've mentioned, the public administration is a huge place, 250,000 people, and they're all in really different contexts. So what we did there is to try to have different programs for different needs and contexts. So we had virtual courses, individual virtual courses, we had group workshops, we had innovation marathons or community meetups, depending on the context and the needs of each public servant. Once we had enough evidence that these prototypes worked, we partnered with the School of Government of Argentina that had a really good structure and systematized processes that we could use to scale all of our training, right? So basically we enrolled all of our training innovation courses in their system, and public servants would take these courses and they could gain credit points. And those credit points were useful for them to ask for higher wages, or maybe to ask for another position within the federal government. So how much do you scale? Well, as much as you need to gain leverage. In our case, this was 36,000 public servants, and this made a lot of noise. And making noise initially is good because it gives you leverage to influence in the decision-making process of the government. But in this process, of course, we faced a great challenge, and we realized that there's this kind of trade-off between reaching a high number of public servants impacted in your training programs versus the depth of skills that you can develop in those public servants. So basically it is a lake approach versus a blue hole approach. And the question I would like to ask here is it possible to skip this trade-off and achieve an ocean approach where we can have a depth and reach at the same time, but to make this sustainable in time, right? Maybe it's the train the trainers approach, maybe it's building small communities and those communities to impact and train other people. There are different ideas going on that we can discuss in a little bit. And the second challenge and the second thing we realize is that capability is not the same as behavior. So capability is tools, knowledge, methodology, but that does not translate to actually doing things. So in other words, that we had impacted in more than 36,000 people in training does not necessarily mean that we had changed the culture of the government, because behavior also involves motivation and opportunity to actually apply what they had learned in their work or in their roles. And the last insight or the last thing I want to mention, and with this I'm going to close, is I I think that the COVID-19 is showing us the importance of using behavioral insights to understand people's behavior, and specifically mass behavior, right? So if changing the culture of a government is ultimately about people, then maybe we should be using and leveraging on behavioral insights to foster government's transformation.
Thank you all for that very quick, rapid run through of your work, and some interesting questions around scale. And let's see if we can touch on some of them. I know we are limited with time, but I want to hand it over to Neil to kind of finish this tour de force in terms of sharing experiences. Neil, what would you like to share from the Canadian context?
Great, thanks, Jesper. In the interest of time, I'll try and make 3 points. The first point is just to share what we're doing in the area of digital and digital learning and what that looks like now in terms of COVID-19. Secondly, I just want to share some experiences with some of our Pathfinder projects, our innovation projects. And thirdly, I'll just give a couple of my own views on the current situation. In the realm of digital, we've been iterating, but we've landed on a model that has us really focusing on digital foundations. There's a huge demand for that. We are rolling out products, both synchronous and asynchronous, for basic digital training. And if any of you want to check it out, you can go to busrides.ca as a little mobile website where we feature some of that work. We also have a premium level, which very much is a practice by doing on multidisciplinary teams around a problem and creating a prototype. And we finished a cohort with 100 learners in that just in the last couple of months. And we're going to be sharing lessons learned from that with everyone. And on digital, the other tier is on leadership. And it's no surprise to anyone that actually the mindsets and behaviors of leaders is one of the major blockers to the digital approach to governing. We have changed our formats. We've pivoted. We have most of our instruction now is mostly asynchronous. We try to get excellent presentations. We assign homework, and we reserve the synchronous online format for discussion and reinforcement. And we are trying to find some good agile games and other, actual workshop type activities that we can do online. I'm happy to share more after this, Jesper, by email at our digital offerings. The second area is our Pathfinder projects. This is an area where we try to attract funding from other government departments so that they're sort of our board of directors. And we put together projects around AI or blockchain or data analytics or semantic analysis in order to demonstrate the art of the possible. We're having a lot of success here. We take these projects to demonstration or prototype and not beyond. So there's no pretense of scaling them across the system here. But nevertheless, we feel this is a really important way to educate and inspire and involve public servants across the piece. And we've been working with about 30 regulatory agencies and getting great results on training algorithms to do some legal analysis and some regulatory policy analysis, and also to do some good old-fashioned evaluative work using novel data analytic techniques and linkages. We're also having success through community building. So we're building a data community, we've built a policy community, and the formation of these communities as informal networks, we're having a lot of success developing and moving training out to departments in that way. And in all of these areas, we're unfunded, so we're held accountable to departments, and if they don't see value in it, we don't continue with it. So just lastly then, just a few, I don't know if others share this sentiment, but obviously managing during COVID requires empathy as a new superpower, and it requires focus as a new superpower, and both empathy and focus are really important for innovation activities. But in addition to that, the formats that we're seeing now are more inclusive, they're more scalable, they're more shareable. Also from a leadership perspective, there's a greater shared sense of imperative and a greater acceptance of new forms of doing things. So my general thought is that for the innovation leader, there's more opportunity than there is peril in the current situation. And in fact, really excited to be in the innovation space at this time because there's a lot of opportunities for it. I'll stop there, Jesper.
Thanks, Neil, for that quick run through of your activities. And as with all the others, there's so much to dive into and so many questions that are probably burning in that sense. So what we'll do now is to try to, speaking of reflective spaces, we'll give a 10-minute reflective space in the groups of 3, which Nicole will divide out in 1 second, to give you a little bit of a chance to digest what you just heard. I created a sort of a slide that may be useful, but basically we just want to give you the time to kind of air burning questions and thoughts you might have. And then we'll bring it back into the group for the last 10 or 15 minutes. Some of you may have to leave at that point, which is okay. The rest of us who can stay for to half of the hour will do so. But for now, Nicole, would you mind putting people into groups of 3, and then we'll return to the plenary in 10 minutes. All right, welcome back. I thought that was nice to kind of get a bit of reflection space after that tour de force. And I must highlight that this was never meant to kind of have a final synthesis, but this was more like a stock take from multiple angles. So hopefully you get the drift and you had some inspiration in one way or the other. So I'm not sure exactly how to do the last 13 minutes. As I mentioned before, if someone has to leave at this time, please do, and you're excused. Thanks so much for being with us. So I'm going to basically open the floor to anyone who has reflections, the questions they want to be asking. We have 15 people on the call now, and that should be manageable. So I'll shut up, and if panelists also want to reflect on each other's presentations, feel free to do that as well. So the floor is yours. Don't hold back.
I'm going to jump in because we actually broke off a conversation that was about consultants that are asked right now to help with a crisis management, where I thought, and maybe Beth and Sam can add to that, it would be super interesting to bring that into a kind of safe space conversation. But also, as I wrote to you, I think one question of mine is, who are the future learners? Who are the future facilitators? And how can we actually also include younger generations as some kind of not only inspirational thought givers, but as somebody who we have to take serious as people that are 30 years within the public sector, having been worked through their ways through the structure, but maybe also being a little bit slow and fearful of taking those big changes.
Can
Javier.
I quickly jump in? Or?
Oh, Bas. Okay, let's do Bas and then Javier.
Sorry, Javier. No, it's just a few quick reflections from my side, also related to the COVID-19 crisis. I kind of really like what Beth was kind of pointing out, is the kind of getting things done ability and mentality. And I mean, kind of what I said, what I see with the accelerator labs, that they kind of, that's what they're bringing to the table in a way. But I think this COVID crisis was only, that's what's currently happening or what recently happened. But how, let's assume that there is a perpetual crisis, and where we need a much more action-oriented approach of quickly responding to things, because doing an analysis first and then create a plan does not work in that situation. So in a way that almost kind of requires a complete reconfiguration of the kind of skills and mindsets that you bring into an organization like the government or an organization like the UN. And it also, I put a comment in the chat about, I mean, we do all this kind of training stuff and learning design, but there is also a much bigger conversation to be had with HR managers or talent management, however you might frame it, And that's also what I noticed within the conversations I had at UNDP, because often they have no idea about these innovation skills or how to recruit for it. I mean, it's a big question mark, how to manage it, how to retain it, but loads of these kind of things as well. So we should make sure that we don't do that navel gazing exercise, but also kind of open it up for other people that are related to what we're trying to do.
Is there any HR managers on the call? Then we failed. Sorry, Beth. Go on.
We're all HR managers.
Yeah.
That's true. Thanks, Neil.
No, and I think it's the last kind of bit of a reflection is also listening to all these presentations, and it kind of made me realize again the kind of multifaceted nature of this work, that it involves so many kind of different things of looking and talking about it. It's kind of a quick comment I made to Sam. And yeah, I think we've only seen the tip of the iceberg, but there is so much more to learn. And my question would be, in that sense, where do we, if we have to place our bets, where should we place our bets? Where do we think we can make the biggest change in terms of accelerating this capacity building within the public sector? And I put the kind of reflective practices out there. And also want to highlight the great work that Kelly did previously in that article that she wrote, and I mean, I still share it with many people. But what are the kind of the 3 or 5 best bets that we can place at the moment?
I like that question, Bas. Let's let people reflect on that. Javier, did you have a question as well, or a comment?
Yes, thank you so much for organizing this space. Perhaps one of the most important gaps that we were noticing now in the breakout room in the discussion was about the funding. So what makes public innovation learning possible in terms of not just putting money on the table that funds the people that makes the learning happen, but putting it where it matters most. And I want to connect it with one of the things that resonated the most with me in the session, which was the battle of epistemologies that you were presenting, Beth, because it seems from our experience here in Colombia that convincing the decision makers that have access to funding to not just put the money on the table, but put it where it matters depends on somehow solving this battle and trying to, like, you know, provide evidence of how this other epistemology can be fruitful to deliver. And in this period of crisis, that seems really critical. So I just leave that on the table. Also, because if we understand public innovation as not just public sector innovation, but innovation in response to public challenges, then it's not only a question about learning for public officials, but learning for everyone that is participating in the responses to public challenges. So how does the funding for this ecosystem or system-wide learning work? And how do we solve the battle of epistemologies to make that funding happen?
That is an even better question, Javier. I'm going to see if anyone has some useful thoughts there on either of those two from Bas, Javier. Sam, you're unmuted, so I might ping on you if you have any thoughts to share. Sorry.
That might have been a mistake on my part. I think the good thing is my house is quiet, which is not during the day. But the kind of gaps that I'd see are around, I think the evaluation, someone brought up evaluation before. In the chat.
Neil.
I think that's a really interesting question around how we, you know, the challenge of creating reflective space to learn, and how we actually integrate evaluation and move it from that very academic orientation, very retrospective, very judgmental. You've tried to do this, you failed. That's not actually useful in our context. We want to learn and improve, and how we integrate, move evaluation into something that's actually getting used in practice, that's something that's really occupying our mind at the moment as we're moving into this new opportunities, new change environment, theoretically. How do we start to bring this in so that it's part of current practice as opposed to let's go do an evaluation because we need to get the money and have that funding redone again. So that's something that I've seen as a real issue.
Thank you, Sam.
So if anyone knows how to do it, please contact me.
Can I ask go on, who was first there? Neil, and then Caroline.
I just wanted to say, I don't think anyone can say they know exactly how to do it, but I do think the experimentation community and the data community and the evaluation community need to merge. And that's a bit of a force fit in many organizations. So for me, at least, that's really powerful. So through changes in governance and policy and even sometimes structures, trying to merge those three areas and not allow them to be discrete has been really important for us in Canada.
Are you doing that through the community approach you're mentioning, Neil, or is that doable that way?
In part. I mean, I do think you have to be a full spectrum warrior in sort of bringing these things together. The community approach really helps because the community is not well defined, so you can get away with a lot under the rubric of a community, in my mind, in terms of challenging existing structures.
Caroline, we're about to.
I send it in the chat, it's fine. My question was more in terms of how can we extend this exchange? How can we maybe also gather resources so we find it a little bit more easily together? I don't know, maybe Beth, like working across 60 countries and 60 labs, you have a way of doing that, but I would be super interested how we can actually strengthen the work across the sectors, but also the different countries.
I think that's probably a good way to end this conversation, sort of this response to ways of communicating, and we will certainly on our side, if this group is okay to rejoin each other. So we put a lot of stuff on the table now, a lot of questions, a lot of practices. So there's a lot more to dive into in more depth, and we'd like to be a part of that. So if everyone wants to be a part of that conversation to continue, yeah, let us know, either now in the chat or after the session. For now, I just want to thank everyone for sharing their experiences. To the speakers, I'm so impressed with what people are doing, and to everyone for joining in to this rather nerdy chat around innovation learning, but not less important in that respect. But thank you all for now, and we'll be in touch. And as I say, yeah, do share your sentiments around being a part of this conversation going forward.